At Apple's One More Thing event in November, we got our first look at the newest MacBook featuring the M1 chip. Since then, the hardware's been rolled out, and I was able to get my hands on the latest MacBook Air. If you watched the event, you know Apple really emphasized the performance capabilities M1 brings to the table and even talks about how the latest Air lineup can handle video editing. As a lifelong Mac user, specifically a lifelong MacBook Pro user and ZDNet's editor, I thought that was really intriguing. I've never been able to use an Air, so I wondered what would happen if I replace my current workhorse, a MacBook Pro with 32 gigs of RAM, and used the 16 gigs of RAM M1 MacBook Air. So for the last couple of weeks, this has been my daily user. And overall, I have to say, I'm really impressed. This thing is, for the most part, been able to handle all of my responsibilities at work. I've not gotten behind because it's crashing, because it can't handle what I need. But let me tell you a few of my favorite things and my least favorite things. I guess before we get too far, maybe explaining what the M1 chip is would be important. So previously, every MacBook ever released was ran on an Intel-based processor, meaning that Apple didn't have complete control over the MacBooks like they do their iPhones, their iPads, because all of that's built in-house. Finally, Apple cut the cord with Intel and built their own chip, what they're calling M1. So what's this mean for you? Apple says M1 is a faster processor, it optimizes battery life, and it allows you to install iPhone or iPad apps. The switch to M1 also brought a super quiet active cooling system to the Pro lineup and completely removed the fan from the Air. I know personally when I was using my MacBook Pro, it sounded like a rocket taking off. So getting rid of that fan system, was concerning because I didn't know if the Air would be able to stay cool enough to run exactly what I needed, but I was intrigued. My overall impressions, this thing is fast. Really, really fast. From just browsing the web to downloading video to opening applications, this thing responds quickly and accurately to what I want. Opening Creative Cloud apps, it takes about 12 seconds. The fastest I saw was 4 seconds when I opened Photoshop. That's going from the initial double click to when the app's ready to use. The M1 chip has clearly optimized the everyday use in MacBook Air, so just typing, web browsing, incredibly fast. But as someone who's always been a decked out Pro user, it really didn't slow down my workload at all. I understand that Creative Cloud is still running Intel-based applications and not M1-based applications just yet, and my entire review so far has been based on that Intel experience, despite running an M1 machine. So I expected that there would be issues, but that doesn't mean that I wasn't impressed by the functionality offered without a major system reboot. Creative Cloud was where I saw most of my issues, but that was expected, but none of them were earth-shattering. In Premiere, I saw a lot of issues with switching from tool to tool and doing that quickly. That was when the beach ball would pop up often. The export time was a bit slower with the M1 Air, but I'm going to attribute that to being a fanless system and still being Intel-based, not M1-based. They understand that this thing does not have a fan in it. Creative Cloud's not going to mess that up. I didn't realize how annoying my previous Pros have been with the fan. The silent nature of the M1 Air is absolutely incredible. The only thing I hear when I'm using it is me tapping on the trackpad or typing. I haven't noticed a dramatic decrease in production using the Intel-based application, so that leads me to believe that the M1-based apps are going to perform better. Overall, Big Sur and M1 have been impressive running a system that was not intended for them. They have been fast, they have been responsive, and there have only been a few minor bugs. My biggest complaint with this, and the reason I can't make this my daily user, the audio in the M1 Air was my breaking point. In my testing experience, this was the only thing that would keep me from giving up my Pro and switching to an Air full time. I would have to edit to the audio tracks on my Pro and then switch back over to my Air to continue the testing process because the audio outputs are underwhelming in the M1 Air. The M1 Air offers stereo speakers with wide stereo sound and 3-mic array with directional beamforming, but comparatively, my Pro is running a high-fidelity 6-speaker system with force-canceling woofers, wide stereo sound, and studio-quality 3-mic array with high signal to noise ratio and directional beamforming. That's a mouthful, but what it means is these speakers in this Air are not built for video editing. It was incredibly frustrating not getting the same output here as I typically do on my Pro. I was not able to use Audition with this. That's a hardware issue. That's not a chip issue. That's something you get from an Air versus a Pro. So for me, that was my breaking point because video editing is so crucial based on sound. For you, that might not be an issue if you're more into Photoshop, Lightroom, those types of Creative Cloud accounts that aren't using that sound. But as a video editor who's typically using Media Encoder, Audition, Premiere, I need sound, and this wasn't it. Overall, though, I have to say I'm really impressed. When I first started testing this MacBook Air, I didn't expect to make it a full day without being completely annoyed, behind on my work, this thing dragging. It didn't. It exceeded my expectations. It runs flawlessly, and honestly, this will become my everyday user for sending emails, for doing web browsing. I'm currently running a 2015 MacBook Pro as my personal computer, and I think that's going to need to be updated to this MacBook Air because it can do everything that MacBook Pro could, but faster. Like I said earlier, these were all Intel-based reviews running on the MacBook Air M1 chip. I'll be looking for Creative Cloud to come out with more releases. Everything will be switched eventually over to the M1 chip, and I will do a follow-up review to see what improvements were made, what bugs were taken out, and if everything is still running as smoothly as it did. Hopefully it'll be running better. So for all things M1, be sure to stick with ZDNet.